In the town of Westlake, Louisiana, a peculiar evening unfolded in the Bennett household. The aroma of roast chicken and buttered potatoes filled the air, a typical scent for a family dinner. Yet, something was amiss. Mr. Bennett, a man with a usually cheerful disposition, took his seat at the dinner table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a jarring sound. His wife and 3 children sat in silence, their eyes downcast, forks poised but unmoving. He looked around the table, trying to discern what had cast this muted spell over this usually lively gathering. His wife, Mrs. Bennett, had prepared a feast, her usual ingredients of love and care found within. But tonight, she offered no kindness and no smiles. The children, Timothy, Rachel, and Samantha, stared at their plates, staring blankly in silent contemplation. The father cleared his throat, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence. His voice echoing through the dining room, he asked his wife how her day was. Mrs. Bennett, a woman whose laughter was usually the heartbeat of the home, didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at him, the ice cubes in her drink clinking gently against the glass as they continued to melt, along with his attempts to speak to his family. The children remained mute, their eyes flicking up briefly before returning to their food. The father's smile faltered, his eyes darting from one face to the next. He had come home early from work to surprise them, even picked up a box of chocolate chip cookies for dessert. But his efforts seemed to have landed on deaf ears. Mr. Bennett felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The silence was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, trying to understand the sudden coldness that had invaded his house. With a sigh, he pushed back his chair and stood up. The legs scraped the floor again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. He began to clear his dishes, the clank of the silverware against the plates, a stark contrast to the quiet. His movements were deliberate, his mind racing with questions and confusion. He glanced over his shoulder at his family, hoping for a change in their demeanor. But as he watched, they remained eerily still. It was as if they were mannequins in a museum display, frozen in time. His children's eyes remained on their food, each still having not so much as taken a single bite. His wife's hand resting below her glass, the ice long since melted into a pool of water that reflected the flickering candlelight, dancing above its waxy home, the centerpiece of the feast before her. He tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest, attributing it to a long day at the office and his own overactive imagination. Perhaps they are just deep in thought. Perhaps they are worried about what has been happening in their small community. A serial killer at large. They call him the Shadowman. The entire community was on alert. Neighbors, friends, and family, all terrified of this threat within their town. Hoping that this was it, he smiled, knowing that his family, although worried, would be safe. He would never let anything happen to them. With a forced smile, Mr. Bennett excused himself, retreating to the sanctuary of his bedroom. He lay down on the cool sheets, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could have possibly done to warrant such a reaction from his loved ones. He tried to convince himself it was just the worry of this threat, just a family terrified of the fear it instilled. But he would keep his family safe. Soon, they would realize this, he thought. Soon they would feel safe, knowing that he would secure their home and would never let anything hurt his loved ones. As the minutes ticked by, his eyes grew heavy with the weight of the unspoken words that lingered in the air. Once drifting off to sleep, Mr. Bennett felt the surrounding and eerie stillness of his home become tranquil, inducing a peaceful slumber, a safe retreat from the recent sense of despair. He laid still as his mind began to slip into a relaxing darkness. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the sound of his bedroom door being violently thrown open. His heart hammered in his chest as several dark figures, silhouetted by the hallway lights, burst into the room. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with shock and fear as the flashlights blinded him, the beams bouncing off the walls and ceiling like a strobe in a nightclub of his worst fears. His senses on high alert, he could make out the unmistakable shapes of guns pointed at him, ready to unleash a chaos that didn't belong in this peaceful suburban home. They yelled to him to get on the ground. The voice was commanding, authoritative, and Mr. Bennett now had no doubt this voice belonged to the police. But why? Why are police in his house? His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that had invaded his home. As he squinted through the glaring lights, the figures came into focus. 2 police officers, dressed in tactical gear, had stormed into his room. Their faces were stern, their eyes unwavering. He felt a cold handcuff snap around his wrists, jolting him into reality. The cold metal bit into his skin, a stark reminder that this was no nightmare. The officers read him his rights as he stared at them in disbelief. "What's happening?" he thought to himself. The words hung in his mind, unanswered. His eyes darted to the blood-soaked bed, his mind reeling with horror. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. But there it was, a crimson stain seeping into the fabric, along with the silent screams of violence. His wife and children's faces flashed before his eyes, their blank expressions now haunting him in a new, terrifying light. Panic surged through his veins as the reality of the situation set in. The officers tightened their grip on his arms and led him out of the room, down the hallway. Each step felt like a mile, his legs heavy with dread. His eyes caught a glimpse of Timothy's bedroom door, slightly ajar. The sight that greeted him was a horror show worthy of a Hollywood slasher. The room was a canvas of red, splattered across the walls with dark blood pooling on the floor. His son's bed was overturned, the mattress slashed and stained. But Timothy himself was nowhere to be seen. They descended the staircase, Mr. Bennett's heart racing with every step. Crimson trail grew thicker, painting a macabre picture on the once pristine beige carpet. The bloodstains on the steps were unmistakable, a grim path that led down to the ground floor. Rachel and Samantha's bedroom doors were open, both rooms in a similar state of disarray, their beds drenched in a crimson hue. Yet, there was no sign of his daughters. The house felt like a tomb, filled with the scent of iron and fear. And as they rounded the corner, that was when he saw it. His family was still at the dinner table, but the scene was far from the warm, inviting picture he had left. Their bodies were lifeless, propped up in their chairs as if in a grisly play. Blood had been meticulously smeared on their faces, giving them grotesque smiles that didn't reach their vacant eyes. Their arms were glued to the table, fingers curled around their silverware, which was stained a dark red. The sight was so surreal, so horrifying, that for a moment he thought it couldn't be real. But then, he noticed something that snapped him out of his daze and brought him back to reality. The real Mr. Bennett was there, in the center of the living room, tied to a chair, his clothes torn and bloodied. An officer and a paramedic working quickly to free him, their movements a blur of urgency. Mr. Bennett's eyes were wide with terror, his chest heaving as he took in great, ragged breaths. The imposter looked at the father, his own eyes filled with a dawning realization. The true Mr. Bennett had been forced to watch his impersonator commit the unspeakable, to feel the agony of losing his wife and children while being powerless to stop it. And then, finally, the Shadowman smiled, as he was escorted out of the Bennett's home, a wake of bloody horror behind him.